So yes, thank you very much for coming and attending today. I'm very excited to present this research. I think it's very fitting, especially with it being International Women's Day today, to look at how feminist solidarity and political activism is taking place around the world, and how it's taking place in different ways around the world. So I started my research looking at women's entrepreneurship in Saudi Arabia over 10 years ago. And this paper, which was just published in Gender Work and Organisation in January, is basically born out of 10 years of research and following up with the same 16 women in the field over a long period of time. So it really feels exciting to discuss this, because there are so many sort of comments and critiques, and rightly so, about Western researchers or Western women researchers kind of parachuting into the region, going in for 5 minutes, doing a few interviews, coming out, and then suddenly to be claiming all these findings and understanding a particular country or context. So having 10 years in the field, whether it's visiting personally or continuing online or via Skype, has been really helpful in trying to understand how the women have really engaged in social change, and in a way that's been quite effective over a long period of time as well. I think it's important to also say that I lived in Saudi Arabia from age 6 to 17 and continued to visit well into my 20s. So there was some kind of also, it's important to declare my position within it as well. And I discuss this quite a lot reflexively within the paper, in the methodology chapter of the paper. So when I started doing the research, looking at women's entrepreneurship in Saudi Arabia, there really were no papers out there on it, and I was looking at the usual kind of topics and debates around opportunities, boundaries, how they negotiated these boundaries, how they dealt with issues, legal obstacles within the household, etc. And I never really imagined that I would end up doing research looking at using concepts like political activism or feminist solidarity. But there was kind of an awakening for me to examine and delve into these concepts after the Me Too movement really took place in 2018, and also when the Arab Spring movement began in 2011 and is continuing until today in various forms. A movement which women and Arab women have been a very big and integral part of as well, but we know so little about it. When we look at the Arab Spring movements in particular, it's very much around what does it mean politically, what does it mean economically, and whenever women are mentioned, it's very much around issues, again, very devastating issues around gender-based violence, etc. But there isn't enough really coverage on the incredible everyday practices that the women are engaging in to lead to social change within the region. So looking at these different literature, there's been this kind of re-emergence of solidarity as a transnational concept, something around the global sisterhood. And when I delved further into that literature, I was quite amazed at how the definitions and the terms that are used just could not really speak to me and the women that I'd been working with for so many years. I also was engaging in research with Syrian women refugees who are engaging in various forms of political activism. And I felt that these definitions, these concepts, these words, these explanations were just very difficult to put into the context that I was looking at. So they would describe feminist organizing or social movements or social transformations would take place through democratic engagement. These would be explicitly visible actions. There would be resistance towards capitalist and neoliberal regimes. There'd be spaces allowing for rigorous critique, for dissent, for rage, for frustration, desire for connection, and these were all important for sustainable feminist political transformation. But when I was looking at different Middle Eastern countries and going back and talking to the women in Saudi Arabia, or really trying to contemplate what they were going through, I had to ask myself the question, how can we as feminist scholars reflexively and contextually draw upon the current conceptualizations of feminist solidarity and political activism, social change, when it's not explicitly visible in a contemporary social movement, where political engagement resistance simply can't take place through democratic engagement, where there's no space for rigorous critique, dissent, there's no legal platform for collective political activism or effective dissidence, where there are no feminist social movement organisations to unite them, there is no stage where you can exhibit rage, frustration and an open desire for connection with other women and creating a form of solidarity. So it really made me wonder, okay, how can I search for different ways that I knew that nothing was happening, I knew something was happening, but there must be another platform or something else that the women are using to engage in these forms of social change, or more specifically political change. So that's when I kind of went back to the women entrepreneurs and started to talk to them about this, but also revisited the gender and entrepreneurship literature. And as many of you here know who look at it, so I won't sort of burden you with all the details, but we know that entrepreneurship is a very gendered concept, gendered masculine, even if it's supposed to be gender neutral. It's very much focused on economic activity and productivity, and it has been criticised for not really appreciating the impact on social change, particularly women's entrepreneurship's impact on social change. We do have research over the last 10 years that's looking at social entrepreneurship, social change, social innovation, but to really engage in women's entrepreneurship and social change, there's more that needs to be done. Some has been done, but we need to do a lot more. And when I was looking into those papers that did discuss entrepreneurship as social change, or women's entrepreneurship as social change, you know, there was this kind of explicit or implicit use of the word empowerment, and it felt very much it was about the empowerment of the entrepreneur herself, her family, and knock-on effect on her community, increasing employment. But there really wasn't this explicit investigation of how women's entrepreneurship can be used as a social movement, as a form of political activism in any society, neoliberal, democratic, totalitarian regime, whatever it may be. So I felt that there was really a strong need to explore how women entrepreneurs collectively, not as individuals, use their entrepreneurial platform for solidarity with women and political activism for women. So based on what I just took you through in the previous slides around those concepts that we were looking at, I knew that I would have to turn to a post-colonial feminist perspective to try and unpack the way that we've done research and the way that we understand women's activism. And of course, there are many debates which I won't take you through now because of time, around comparing the West with the rest of the world, othering women in other parts of the world, and really not understanding enough about the politics of location. But reading all this literature through this post-colonial perspective, it really emphasised how the conceptualizations of social movements are rooted in particular Western democratic contexts where political activism is legal and permissible. But I am not saying they're effective, just to make that very clear. Otherwise, we would have closed the gender pay gap and we would have got rid of discrimination and all the issues that Val has talked about many years ago. All I'm saying is that it's legal and permissible. I sort of came to this conclusion that we really need to theorize women's social movements in non-democratic contexts using concepts that are more aware and reflexive of how the West has shaped these concepts and helping us understand what political activism really is. And if we don't do that, and if we fail to do that, then we are just going to silence or ignore or not even see how women around the world are engaging in political change. So I turned to the work of Bayat, who had this theory of the quiet encroachment of the ordinary, and he's done some incredible work in Iran and Egypt and other parts of the world that are non-democratic, and where political movements, social movements are not permissible. And he calls he sort of discusses the concept of social non-movement and how it embodies shared practices of large numbers of ordinary people whose fragmented but similar activities trigger social change. And this strategy of resistance he calls quiet encroachment. So it's disorganized. People are engaging in everyday practices to kind of go against the regime. It might not bring about real change, but actually working at it collectively in a disorganized manner is leading to slight shifts in the system. So based on this, I asked, so how can women's everyday entrepreneuring practices towards social change lead to a feminist social movement as a form of quiet encroachment towards political change in non-democratic contexts? So to give you a very, very brief history, very brief, if we think about political activism as we know it and as we define it, or as I've mentioned in the earlier slides, about going out, marching on the streets, calling for your rights. Saudi women did do that in the 1990s. Women were not allowed to drive until the 24th of June 2018. In the 1990s, they protested during the Gulf War, and 47 women went in their cars and drove in Riyadh. And they were all arrested, put in jail. They were humiliated in newspapers the next day. Those who had government jobs lost them. And obviously there was a lot of shame linked to this to them and their families. But in 2011, there was another movement where women with international driving licenses were going to the streets and they were driving. Many of them had supportive men and guardians beside them. Also, many of these women were arrested and put in jail and not necessarily even given a proper hearing. So, and even in 2018, when they removed the ban, a lot of those women were not released. So, in addition to that, the political and economic pressures has led to unprecedented changes. So, for example, women weren't allowed to vote, drive, rent, they weren't allowed to work in certain industries, they needed permission to work, to open a bank account, to manage their own business if they employed other men. They weren't allowed to enter particular government buildings. But then over the last 10 years, these have all been slowly removed, which is a fantastic change that's taken place. However, until today, women can't pass on citizenship. They need consent from a male guardian to marry. They can't consent for their children to marry. They need male consent to exit prison and a domestic abuse shelter. So there's still more that can be done. In terms of entrepreneurship, so that's kind of one side that I think is really fascinating, something that's to do with the laws and the culture. And then on the other side of it, we've got Saudi Arabia has this Vision 2030, and it's really pushing for women to engage in entrepreneurship because they're estimated to have £9.5 billion in pure cash in their bank accounts. And this is something very important for building their private sector and to stop them from depending on the oil industry. And there has been a massive increase in the number of women entrepreneurs over the last 10 years in particular. So I've already mentioned that this is a longitudinal study and it's been very useful for observing these changes taking place. And if you have any questions later on about my role as a researcher and how that sort of manifested over time, please feel free to ask me in the end. So I'll very, very briefly run you through the last 3 slides where I'll show you how through engaging with my research and going through the data, I was able to find that it actually moving towards political activism through entrepreneurship followed a sort of three-step process. And within that, there were three solidarity practices within those from what I took from my data. So the first stage I call solidarity in isolation. So actually it was the women that kind of went on this journey to entrepreneurship to empower themselves. And then they wanted to empower other women within their organisation. So they provided women-only offices, they provided on-site daycare and safe transport for women to and from work for those who the males in the family were uncomfortable with the women taking public transport when driving wasn't permitted. And many of them couldn't afford cars even after driving was allowed for them. The second stage was what I call sort of from solidarity to solidarity. So really moving on from just working as an individual woman, empowering those within her organisation, to actually going outside and engaging and raising feminist consciousness within their entrepreneurial networks. So, for example, they were providing opportunities for other women within their network to travel. They were actually paying and supporting them to travel and leave the country for work or conferences or other things. They were encouraging and designing different types of traditional clothing so that women wouldn't just be constrained by black clothing. So again, sort of something very visible. And they were providing mentorship at various entrepreneurship events. And finally, I talk about sort of from being an entrepreneur to becoming a political activist. And this is where the women over the last few years, I've seen them really engage with politics through the identity of being an entrepreneur. So you might not be able to march the streets, you might not be able to go and protest, you might not be able to lobby your government for change just from your house. But what you can do is, it seems that for these women who come from a particular class, and again, this is something we can talk about at the end, issues around intersectionality. They were able to actually confront authorities. They're saying, I want to run my business, you need to support me. They started to lobby the government for changes to change current law employment. Also, one of them became a member of the King's Consultative Council. Now, I believe the King has around 150 consultants, and only in the last couple of years, he's allowed 30 women, and one of them was able to make it through to those 30 women and advise. That's a major breakthrough for women, and it's something that entrepreneurship as a platform propelled her into that role. So in terms of contributions, you can read the paper for all the boring contributions, but I think the main things that I want you to take from this presentation is that really we need to research and think more about entrepreneurship as politics. So actually not just looking at it from an individual woman's perspective, but actually looking at how we engage in it as a movement. But that also that this form of solidarity and political engagement, it doesn't have to happen in a way that we know and that we see, democratically, marching the streets, standing together side by side. But actually there are other various quiet methods that allow you to encroach onto these forbidden territories. And this was an example that kind of highlighted that. And in addition to Bayat's original theory, who was saying, well, actually, these non-movements, you know, they're helpful for everyday kind of removing of obstacles, but they don't really engage in proper change. Actually, in the case of these women, I could see that, or I can't give a direct cause and effect link of these 16 women, but what it does show is that engaging in these forms of political change and activism through the kind of quiet encroachment method has led to some legal changes, some organisational changes, and there's also been changes at a broader, more national level as more rules and regulations are coming in at the moment to support women's entrepreneurship and women's employment. And that's all from me. Thank you very much.